I'm William, 52 years old, and my neighbor's daughter just asked me to marry her. Charlotte is 26, red-haired, and scared enough to stand on my porch in the rain with a plan that made no sense. She needed someone to play her fiancé for one weekend at a family reunion, and she picked the quiet man next door who fixes things for a living. I told her it was a bad idea, that her family would see through it, that the age gap alone would raise questions she couldn't answer. She looked at me and said she'd rather face those questions than spend another Sunday being the one who failed. I live on the quiet end of Maple Street in a house I built with my own hands 23 years ago. Back then, I had a wife and a plan that included a second floor and a porch swing and a dog I never got around to adopting. The wife left 5 years back, and the second floor stayed unfinished, and the porch swing is still in the garage in its box. But the house stands solid. I framed it right, set the foundation deep, and used timber that would hold. That's the thing about building something yourself. You know where every load rests, and you know what it can carry. Most days I wake up at 5, drink my coffee on the back steps, and listen to the neighborhood wake up around me before I start whatever job is waiting. I fix leaky faucets for the woman. 2 doors down, replace rotted deck boards for the retired couple across the street, and rewire a bathroom light for whoever calls that week. People don't call me much for conversation. They call because something in their house stopped working, and they know I'll show up with the right tools and leave without talking too much. Charlotte's father moved in next door about 8 years ago, after his wife passed. He's a quiet man himself, keeps his yard neat, waves when I pull out of the driveway, but doesn't stop to chat. I've seen Charlotte a handful of times over the years, coming and going in a car packed with boxes, visiting for a weekend, then disappearing back to whatever life she built in the city. I knew she was his daughter, and I knew she had red hair, and that was about the size of it. That Tuesday I was in the garage, replacing a hinge on an old cabinet door, when I heard the knock. It wasn't the kind of knock you get from a neighbor needing a favor. It was fast and tight, like the person on the other side had rehearsed it and was running out of nerve. I set the hinge down and wiped my hands on my jeans and walked through the house to the front door. Charlotte stood on my porch with rain in her hair. She wore a sundress that was too thin for the weather, and her arms were crossed tight against her chest, and she looked like she'd been standing there a long time before she worked up the courage to knock. I'd seen her from a distance, but up close she was different. Her eyes were green and sharp and scared, in a way that made me think of a dog I once pulled out of a drainage ditch, the kind of scared that doesn't go away just because the danger is gone. She said she needed a husband by Sunday. I waited for the rest of the sentence, the part that would make it a joke or a setup for something else, but it never came. She just stood there, rain dripping off the porch, eave onto her shoulder, looking at me like I was the last person on a very short list. I didn't laugh or tell her to come inside. I leaned against the doorframe and asked her what she meant. She didn't come inside right away. She stood on the porch and talked fast, like if she slowed down she'd lose the thread and never pick it back up. Charlotte had been living in the city for 4 years, working at a marketing firm that paid enough to cover rent and not much else. Every holiday, every birthday, every random Sunday dinner, her mother asked the same questions in different outfits. When Charlotte was getting married, when she was settling down, when she was going to give her grandchildren. Her older sister had 2 kids and a husband who coached Little League, and her mother held that up like a blueprint every time Charlotte came home. 6 months ago at the last family reunion, her mother cried in the kitchen. Not the loud kind of crying, but the quiet kind. The kind that happens when someone thinks they're alone, and Charlotte walked in and caught her. Her mother said she worried Charlotte would end up alone, that she was watching her daughter drift and couldn't do anything about it. Charlotte said the words just came out before she could stop them. She told her mother she was seeing someone, that it was new, that she didn't want to jinx it by talking about it too soon. Her mother stopped crying and smiled for the first time in months. But the lie grew. Over the phone, her mother asked about the man, and Charlotte gave her details because the alternative was admitting she'd made it all up. She said his name was William, which was true, because she'd been watching me work in my yard from her father's kitchen window for longer than she wanted to admit. She said he was kind and quiet and good with his hands. She said they were getting serious. And 3 weeks ago, her mother called and said the whole family was coming to the lake house for a reunion, and she couldn't wait to meet this man Charlotte had been talking about for half a year. That's when the lie became a fiancé. Her mother told her sister, and her sister told her cousins. And by the time the word came back to Charlotte, it had been upgraded to a full engagement with wedding plans already underway and a family that couldn't stop celebrating. And the reunion was on Sunday. I listened to all of this, standing in my doorway, with sawdust on my hands. I told her it was a terrible idea. I said I was too old, that I wasn't an actor, that her family would take one look at me and know something was wrong. I said I didn't want to be part of a lie that big, not with people I'd never met, not for a whole weekend. Charlotte's face didn't change while I talked. She'd heard all of it before, in her own head, probably louder than I was saying it. Then she said something that caught me. She said she wasn't asking for a wedding. She was asking for a weekend, 2 days at a lake house 2 hours north. Show up on Saturday and leave Monday morning. She said she just needed one Sunday where her mother didn't look at her with that face, that worried face that made Charlotte feel like she was broken and everyone could see it. She said she'd rather stand next to a stranger and pretend than walk in alone one more time and watch her family rearrange their pity around her. I knew that feeling. I'd been the one at the other end of it, the one people looked at with careful eyes after my wife left. The man whose marriage failed, who must have done something wrong, who lives alone now and fixes other people's houses because he can't fix his own. I recognized the shape of what she was describing. The way pity can make a person feel smaller than being alone ever did. I told her I'd think about it, and she nodded and walked back to her father's house through the rain. I didn't think about it. I went back to my hinge and turned it over in my hands and knew I was going to say yes before I picked up the phone to call her. She came back the next morning with coffee and a notebook. She'd written things down which told me she'd been up most of the night planning. We sat at my kitchen table, and the house felt different with someone in it. I noticed that and tried not to think about it too hard, the way a man tries not to look at a crack in the wall because he knows what it means. Charlotte laid out the rules like she was reading a contract. There would be no kissing on the mouth, no invented details that could be checked, and we'd keep the story vague enough that nobody could trip us up with specific questions. The whole thing ends Sunday night with no exceptions, no extensions, and no follow-up calls. I agreed to all of it and added one rule of my own. I said I wouldn't lie about my age if someone asked me directly, because I'd spent enough years watching men pretend to be younger, and it always made them look worse. Charlotte said that was fine, but her face tightened when she said it. I could see her doing the math, 52 minus 26, and watching the number land. She said she'd tell her family I was 40, which was a lie. I'd have to stand next to all weekend. I told her again that I wouldn't do that. And the way she said okay made me think she was already calculating how much damage the truth could do. I compared it to the work I know. A crooked hinge can be straightened if you catch it early and use the right shim. A stripped screw can be replaced. But a lie is different because a lie doesn't sit still. It bends under pressure, and the more weight you put on it, the more it bends, until you can't tell which part is true anymore and which part you just made up, to keep the whole thing from collapsing. I knew this going in because I've fixed enough houses to know that some problems don't get better by covering them up. But I'd already said yes, and I wasn't going to take it back. Charlotte asked if I had a suit. I said I had a clean shirt and a pair of pants that weren't covered in drywall dust. She said that would work, and then she asked if I had a ring. I told her I didn't, and she said she'd handle it. She left with a notebook and the empty coffee cups, and the kitchen went quiet again, and I sat there for a while after she was gone. I kept turning over the same thought that I'd agreed to spend a weekend, pretending to be something I wasn't, for a woman I barely knew, in front of a family that would be looking at me like I was the answer to their prayers. The strange part was that it didn't feel like a mistake. It felt like picking up a tool I hadn't used in years and finding it still fit my hand. Thursday afternoon, Charlotte came back with a list of questions her family would probably ask, and we sat at the table again and built a history that never happened. She said we met when her father hired me to replace the porch railing, which was true because I had done that job 2 summers ago. The story went that she came home for a weekend, and we talked over the fence while I was working, and I asked her if she wanted to come over for coffee. The rest was supposed to be slow, the way good things are supposed to be. A few weeks of porch sitting and long conversations before I asked her to dinner. I was surprised by how easily the lies came to her. Charlotte filled in details I wouldn't have thought of. Small things that made the story feel lived in. My favorite food was grilled chicken off the grill, which happened to be true, and our first date was at a diner 2 towns over called Miller's, which I'd actually been to a handful of times. I asked her how she knew about the chicken. She'd smelled it through the fence more than once when I was cooking on summer evenings. Then she said something that shifted the air in the room. She told me she'd been watching me from her father's kitchen window for years. Not in a strange way, she said, but in the way you notice someone who's always there, always working, always alone. What she liked was the way I talked to her father over the fence. Patient and simple, never rushing, never acting like the conversation was an interruption. She told her mother about me because I was the first man she'd thought of when she needed a name. And she didn't know what that meant yet. I didn't know what to do with that. I filed it somewhere in the back of my mind, next to the other things I didn't want to examine too closely, and we moved on to the next question on her list. But the room felt warmer after she said it, and I saw that she'd moved her chair closer to mine without either of us acknowledging it. Thursday evening, she came over one more time to practice. Charlotte was dressed differently. Not in the rushed clothes from Tuesday, or the careful outfit from the afternoon. She wore jeans and a green flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and her red hair was down instead of pulled back. The whole look said she was coming over because she wanted to, not because she had to, and I noticed that and told myself to stop noticing it. We practiced the introduction first. She stood in my living room and said, "This is William, my fiancé." And the word fiancé sounded wrong in the space between us, too formal for a room with sawdust in the corners and a coffee ring on the table. I said it back to her, calling her Charlotte, my fiancée, and it sounded even worse in my mouth, like I was reading a line from someone else's life. She coached me on the physical parts. I needed to stand close enough that people believed it, not across the room, but right next to her, close enough that our arms touched. Charlotte showed me how to hold her hand, fingers laced, not the stiff grip of 2 strangers, but the easy hold of 2 people who'd been doing it for months. I took her hand, and it was small and warm, and I held it the way she showed me, and something about the fit of it made me hold on 3 seconds longer than the drill required. She didn't pull away, and neither of us mentioned it. Then she showed me the ring. It was a thin gold band she'd found at a thrift store, the kind of ring that had probably belonged to someone's grandmother and ended up in a jewelry box at an estate sale. It was too big for her finger, loose enough that it would slide off if she moved her hand too fast. Without thinking, I said I could size it. I went to the garage and came back with a pair of needle-nose pliers and a mandrel I use for shaping metal brackets, and I worked the band carefully until it was a quarter size smaller. When I slid it onto her finger, it fit. She held her hand up and turned it in the kitchen light, and then she looked at me. And the feeling in the room changed into something I didn't have a name for. Saturday morning, I pulled the truck into her father's driveway at 7. Charlotte came out carrying a bag and wearing a blue dress that made her look older than 26, more put together, like someone who had her life arranged and knew where everything went. She tossed the bag in the bed of the truck and climbed into the passenger seat and buckled her seatbelt and didn't say anything for the first 10 minutes. I took the highway north and rolled the windows down because the truck's air conditioning hadn't worked in 2 years, and I'd never bothered to fix it. The morning air was cool and smelled like rain from the night before, and the road was empty enough that I could set the cruise control and let my hands rest easy on the wheel. Charlotte fidgeted with the ring on her finger, turning it the way I'd seen people turn a wedding band when they're thinking too hard about something, she started talking about a third of the way into the drive. Her apartment in the city was a one-bedroom with a leaking faucet she kept meaning to fix and a neighbor who played guitar at 2 in the morning. The job was at a marketing firm where she wrote copy for products she didn't care about and sat in meetings where people use words like synergy and bandwidth without irony. She said she liked the work fine, but it didn't feel like building anything. It felt like arranging and rearranging the same pieces and calling it progress. I listened without offering advice or telling her what I thought she should do, because she wasn't asking for that. She was talking the way people talk when they've been holding things in for too long, and finally found someone who'll sit still long enough to hear it. I've been that person before, on both ends of it, and I know that the best thing you can do is keep your hands on the wheel and let the words come out at their own speed. Then she asked about my marriage. I told her it ended 5 years ago. She left on a Thursday in March, and she took the dog and the good dishes and the picture from the hallway, and she left a note on the kitchen table that said she was sorry, but she couldn't do it anymore. I told Charlotte that the hardest part wasn't the leaving. It was knowing she'd been unhappy for a long time, and I'd been too busy with the work to notice. Charlotte said that sounded like her father after her mother died, a man so used to fixing things that he didn't realize the thing most broken was himself. About 20 minutes from the lake house, Charlotte put her hand on the center console between us, palm up, fingers loose. It wasn't part of any rehearsal. There was no audience, no one to perform for, just the highway and the wind and the two of us. I looked at her hand and then at the road, and then I took it without deciding to. We drove the rest of the way like that, not talking, just holding on, and the cab of the truck felt smaller with her in it. I felt that, and I didn't pull away. The lake house sat at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by white pines that filtered the light into long gold columns across the grass. It was big and old. 2 stories, with a wraparound porch and a dock that stretched out over water, so still it looked like a photograph. Cars were parked in the grass along the driveway, a dozen of them, and people moved between the house and the yard carrying dishes and folding chairs and children who ran in circles. Charlotte squeezed my hand before we got out of the truck. She said her mother would probably cry, and her father would shake my hand too hard, and her sister would stare at me from across the yard and try to figure out what was wrong with me. She said to just smile and follow her lead, and if things got rough, to find a reason to step outside and breathe. I told her I'd be fine. I was lying, but it was the kind of lie the whole weekend was built on, so it felt consistent. Her mother reached us before we made it to the porch. A small woman with Charlotte's same green eyes and a face that had been worrying for so long it didn't know how to do anything else. She hugged me too tight and too long, the way a woman hugs a man she's been praying would show up. When she pulled back, she had tears on her cheeks, and she said finally, like the word had been sitting in her mouth for years, waiting for this moment. Her father shook my hand with a grip that was testing me, not hostile but firm, the way a man shakes your hand when he's deciding something about you in real time. He said welcome and nothing else, and his eyes stayed on my face a beat longer than was comfortable. Charlotte's older sister stood at the edge of the porch with a drink in her hand, watching me the way Charlotte said she would, sizing me up from a distance with an expression that wasn't hostile but wasn't welcoming either. Charlotte's mother said, I looked mature, and the word hung in the air like a question she didn't want to ask out loud. Charlotte jumped in with a porch railing story before her mother could circle back to my age, and I held the details together the way we'd rehearsed, the fence, the coffee, the slow beginning. Her mother was too happy to examine it closely. She kept touching Charlotte's arm and looking at the ring, and the ring caught the light, because I'd polished it that morning with a cloth from my toolbox, without telling Charlotte I was doing it. I stood at the edge of things for the next hour, holding a plate of food I wasn't hungry for, watching Charlotte move through the crowd. She was good at this, natural in a way I wasn't, hugging ants and answering questions, and laughing at jokes I couldn't hear. But she kept coming back to me, touching my arm, leaning into my shoulder, and each time she did it, the gesture was supposed to be for show, but it settled something in my chest that I hadn't realized was unsettled. She whispered that I was doing fine, and I believed her, and then I wondered whether believing her was part of the performance or something else. After dinner, Charlotte's father found me on the porch and asked if I'd walk down to the dock with him. It wasn't a question. Charlotte caught my eye from across the yard, and her face said everything her mouth couldn't, that she couldn't help me now, that I was on my own. I followed her father down the wooden steps and across the grass to where the dock stretched out over the dark water, and we walked to the end of it and stood there, with the pines behind us, and the lake in front of us, and the sky turning the color of a bruise. He asked where I met his daughter. I told him the porch railing story, and it came out steady and simple, because I'd practiced it enough that the words felt like memory. When he asked what I did for work, I told him I was a handyman, that I fixed things around the neighborhood, that I'd built my own house. The nod he gave at that felt like it meant something to him, like a man who'd spent his life in offices understood the value of someone who worked with his hands. Then he asked how old I was. The question landed on the dock like a stone dropped into still water. I told Charlotte I wouldn't lie about this, and I looked at her father's face and saw that he already knew the answer wouldn't be what he wanted to hear. I said 52. He went quiet. The lake was dark and flat, and the only sound was the dock boards creaking under our weight and the distant noise of the family still talking on the porch behind us. The silence stretched long enough that I could feel the cool air through my shirt. He said Charlotte was 26. The fact sat on the dock between us, like a card turned face up, not framed as a question. I said I knew. He asked if I thought that was a problem. I said I didn't come here to cause trouble, that she came to me because she needed help, and I said yes because she asked, and that I'd leave Sunday night and never come back if that's what he wanted. His eyes stayed on my face for a long time. Long enough that I thought he was going to tell me to pack up and drive home. In the dark. Then he said something I wasn't ready for. He told me he was glad she wasn't alone anymore. He'd watched her carry the weight of being the one who hadn't figured it out, the one the family worried about, and it had worn her down in ways she wouldn't show anyone. What he said next was that he didn't care how old I was if I was the reason she walked through the door with her shoulders back for once. He patted my shoulder once, hard, and walked back toward the house, and I stood on the dock alone, with his trust sitting heavier on me than his suspicion ever would have, because the trust was real and the engagement was not. That night, Charlotte's mother walked us to a guest room on the second floor and opened the door with a smile that said she'd been planning this moment for months. There was one bed. It was a queen with a quilt that looked handmade, and there were flowers on the nightstand, and 2 towels folded on the dresser, and the room smelled like lavender and clean sheets. Charlotte stood in the doorway beside me, and I could feel her holding her breath. I said I'd sleep on the floor. Charlotte said the floor was fine for me, but her mother would check, because her mother checked everything, and if she found me on the floor, the whole story would unravel before breakfast. We compromised by taking a blanket and a pillow from the bed and making a spot on the floor beside the window, while Charlotte took the bed and we left the door cracked a few inches so it looked the way a door would look if 2 people sharing a room had nothing to hide. In the dark, the room was quiet except for the sound of pine trees moving outside the window and the distant murmur of the family still talking downstairs. Charlotte lay on her back and talked toward the ceiling. She said the reunion went better than she expected. She said her father liked me, and her mother hadn't stopped smiling since we arrived, and her sister had stopped staring and started asking actual questions about where I lived and what kind of work I did. I lay on the floor with the pillow under my head and the blanket pulled up to my chest, staring at the ceiling I could barely see in the dark. She asked if I was awake, and I said yes. Then she asked if I ever thought about starting over, about letting someone in again after the first time went wrong. I said I fix things for a living, and the one thing I've learned is that some things can't be patched, and you can cover a crack with putty and paint over it, and it'll look fine for a while, but the crack is still there underneath, and it'll open again the first time the house shifts. Sometimes you don't patch. Sometimes you tear it out and build new. Charlotte was quiet for a long time after that. I could hear her breathing in the dark, slow and steady, and I thought she'd fallen asleep. Then she said maybe it was time she built something new too, and her voice was so quiet I almost missed it. The way you miss a sound that's softer than the silence around it. I heard her shift in the bed. Her hand appeared over the edge of the mattress, hanging down toward the floor, fingers open. Lying there, looking at her hand in the dark. I thought about the hinge I was fixing when all of this started. How a hinge is a simple thing that connects two pieces that need to move together. And how the whole mechanism fails if one side lets go. I reached up and took her hand. We fell asleep like that. Her arm hanging over the edge of the bed, and mine reaching up from the floor, our hands locked together in the dark like we were holding everything in place. Sunday morning, I woke up on the floor with my hand still in hers. The light was coming through the window in thin gray bars, and I could see her face above me, turned on the pillow, watching me with an expression that wasn't part of any rehearsal. Neither of us let go for a few seconds. Then Charlotte heard her mother's footsteps in the hallway, and she pulled her hand back, and the spell broke like a thread cut with scissors. At breakfast, the family gathered on the porch for eggs and toast and coffee, and I sat across from a man I'd never seen before. Charlotte's sister introduced him as a friend of the family, someone who'd been coming to the reunions for years, a man named Travis who coached soccer with Charlotte's brother-in-law and lived 3 towns over. Charlotte went pale when she saw him. I watched the color leave her face and come back in a flush that climbed her neck to her cheeks, and I understood that this was someone she hadn't told me about. Travis sat across from me and smiled. He was Charlotte's age, clean-shaven, with the kind of easy confidence that comes from never having to try too hard. And his grin said he knew he was making someone uncomfortable and didn't mind. When he asked how Charlotte and I met, I told the porch railing story, and he nodded along like he was hearing it for the first time. Then he asked what Charlotte's coffee order was, a small question thrown out casual, the kind that sounds like nothing, but is actually everything. I didn't know. We talked for hours over 3 days, and I'd listened to her talk about her job and her apartment and her mother and her fears, and I'd held her hand in a truck and on a living room floor, and I didn't know how she took her coffee. I started to answer, and Charlotte cut in with a laugh and a redirect, telling her mother the eggs were perfect and asking for more toast. Travis smiled into his coffee cup and said nothing, but his eyes stayed on me with a look that said he knew something wasn't right. Charlotte pulled me outside to the side porch where nobody could hear us. Her hands were shaking. She said she didn't tell me about Travis because she didn't know he'd be here, because he wasn't family, he was just always around. She said he was the reason she started lying about being engaged in the first place. Her family had been pushing them together for 2 years. Her mother inviting him to dinners, her sister mentioning how good they'd be together, the whole family treating it like a deal that just needed to close. Travis wanted it. Her family wanted it. Charlotte was the only one who didn't, and the engagement lie was the only thing that made them stop. I watched her face and saw something I recognized. She wasn't just avoiding pity. She was refusing a life that someone else had drawn up for her. A set of plans she hadn't asked for and couldn't live inside. I've walked into houses where the owner picked the layout from a magazine and hated it the day they moved in, and every wall felt wrong, and every room was the wrong shape, and they lived with it anyway because tearing it down felt harder than just pretending it fit. Charlotte was standing in that house, and she'd rather build a fake wall than keep living in someone else's floor plan. Sunday afternoon, the family started packing up. Send. Cars filled with coolers and folding chairs and leftover food in foil containers. Charlotte's mother hugged me at the door and cried again. Not sad tears, but the kind that come when something you've been worrying about for years suddenly resolves itself. She said she was so glad Charlotte found someone steady, someone who made her stand taller, and the word steady hit me in the chest because it was the highest compliment I knew how to give a person, and she'd handed it to me like it was mine to keep. Charlotte's father shook my hand at the car. He gripped it the same way he had on the dock, firm and testing, but this time he held on a beat longer and said, "Take care of my girl." I nodded and said I would, and the lie in that sentence was the biggest one of the weekend, because I wasn't her fiancé and I wasn't planning to be. And his trust was the one thing I couldn't fix, no matter how good I was with my hands. Travis found Charlotte by the cars while I was loading our bags into the truck. I watched from the porch as he stepped close and said something I couldn't hear, leaning in with that easy confidence, and Charlotte stepped back. She said something short, and her body language was clear even from 30 feet away. The way her shoulders squared and her chin lifted and her hands went still at her sides. Travis looked stunned for a moment, then he nodded and walked away. And Charlotte came up the porch steps to where I was standing. She said she was done pretending. My stomach dropped because I thought she meant she was done with me, that the weekend was over and the arrangement was finished and I'd go back to my house and she'd go back to the city and the whole thing would become a strange story we both agreed not to tell. But she said she meant she was done pretending with her family. She was going to tell them the truth, that the engagement wasn't real, that she hired a neighbor to play a part because she was tired of being managed and arranged and treated like a project that needed completing. I asked what happens after she tells them. She said she didn't know, and she guessed it would be messy, and her mother would cry again, and her father would feel foolish, and her sister would say she knew it all along. But she said she was done carrying the lie, because the lie had been heavier than the truth ever would be, and she'd rather walk in alone and deal with the pity than stand next to someone and know it was all built on nothing. Then she looked at me, and there was nothing performed in it. No rehearsal, no audience to play for. She said she wanted to know the real William, the one who sized a ring without being asked, and listened to her talk about leaky faucets, and held her hand in a truck without anyone watching. She said she'd rather have something crooked and honest than something perfect and fake. I told her the truth was messier than the story we'd built. She said she was tired of clean stories that didn't fit, that she'd spent 4 years trying to live inside a shape someone else made for her, and she was done. She stood there on the porch, with the pines behind her and the lake flat and silver in the afternoon light, and I thought about all the houses I've worked in over the years. The ones that lasted weren't the ones built perfectly. They were the ones built true, with honest joints and real materials, even if the lines weren't straight and the corners weren't square. We drove home in the late afternoon with the windows down and the highway emptying out as the sun dropped. Charlotte didn't put her hand on the console this time. She fell asleep against the passenger window with her hair across her face and her breathing slow and even, and I drove and thought about what she'd said. A crooked thing. That's honest. I turned that over in my mind the way I turn a piece of wood before I cut it, feeling for the grain, finding where the strength runs. I walked Charlotte to her father's door. She turned before going inside and said she'd see me tomorrow, and it wasn't part of any script. I went home and stood in my quiet kitchen, listening to the silence I'd built my life around. For the first time in 5 years, the quiet didn't feel like the right shape for the room. Something else was filling it, and I didn't want to fix that.